Good morning and welcome. I'm glad you are here. If you prefer just to eat and share fellowship, that's okay. But we're going to go ahead with our class and we're going to start with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, thank you for this world you have made and for our place in it. Open our hearts and our minds as we seek to know you and to serve others in your name. Amen. So at least one of you came up to me in the intervening week and said, when I informed you that we were going to do a 4-week series on Noah and the ark, this person said, what in the world are we going to talk about for 4 weeks? And then said that after last week, actually, maybe there is something for us to talk about. I loved our class last week. It's a 4-week series, and we began last week with why flood the earth? Why is there a flood? This week we're turning to why did God choose Noah to save whatever it is that God chose Noah to save. We'll talk about that this week. Next week we're going to look at why did God make a covenant and what did that covenant look like. And then in the 4th and final week we will look at what happened after that and what does that tell us about who God is and how God works. Let's just start with a text. I've given you a handout. I hope you've got a handout or near it. And I'm wondering if someone would read for us, please. Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 10. Those first 2 paragraphs on your handout. Who might read that? Who would read that for us? Thank you. Jonathan.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
What, two more lines.
2 more. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Thank you. All right, so we read a good bit of that last week, the first part, but I skipped the bit about Noah. As you hear those verses, as you read those verses, anything catch your eye or your ear today? Anything stand out to you of interest? Yes?
Why Noah?
Why Noah? Thank you, yeah.
He was going to kill everybody.
But not Noah. Yeah.
It's like Noah was an afterthought.
Yes. I like that. And I want to invite, that's a good lens, Mike, for the rest of today's session. I want us to live in that tension of God had determined that God was going to blot out all of creation, and then God remembered Noah. And I want us to sort of imagine, I want us to enter the rest of today's lesson in that space about, I wonder why God remembered Noah, and what are we supposed to learn? The deeper question is, what are we supposed to learn from that, why Noah? So we're just going to sit there for the rest of today. All right, what else catches your eye or your ear this morning? Yes.
I guess also that Noah was he the only, because it says Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Was he the only righteous, blameless?
Yeah, isn't that a natural question? Like, are you really telling me that in the whole of creation, and I know we're only, 10 or 11 generations at this point, but really, is Noah really the only righteous one? What is it about him that makes him so special? What does that even mean for him to be labeled that way, right? Yes. Yeah, those questions we're drawn into them. And I think the author of the story, the community that tells this story, wants us to be drawn in and ask those questions. This is... sometimes the questions are fruitful in and of themselves, but they're not fruitful only if they give us an answer. because we're not going to find an answer, but the questioning is part of where we're drawn. Yeah. What else catches your eye or your ear in these first two paragraphs? I have an assistant now, for which I'm grateful. What else? Shannon?
I think I'm more concerned less about Noah in the first reading when it says the Lord was sorry he'd made humankind on the earth and it grieved him to his heart. I mean,
yes.
What a downer. Yes.
And I think we're supposed to, we heard that last week, and we are supposed to fully inhabit that, the magnitude of that. And I suggested last week, and somebody confirmed for me, it's always good when people are talking to you about your Sunday school class on Tuesday. It means the Spirit's doing something. But somebody came up to me and said, yeah, I went back and looked at the Hebrew. God was sorry that he had made it, and that, the fact that God was sorry, grieved him to his heart. So even God is portrayed to us as being a little almost out of control, like almost as if this is inevitable. And God, it grieved God to recognize that God was sorry that he had made everything. And so we're invited into that awkward conflict, that tension, right? Yeah. What? Anything else catch your eye or your ear? Judy?
The first sentence reminds me a lot of today's time, and I wonder if God feels the same way now.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great and the inclination thereof was only towards evil. Yeah. And what about this story is told in every generation, right? We're going to hold on to that until next week, particularly when we look at the covenant, and God says, I promise I won't ever do it again. And then the week after, actually, when we see the rest of Noah's story, we're going to live in that tension about what does that mean? And when I don't want to let the cat all the way out of the bag, but when could God say, oh, you know what, this generation isn't so bad, right? Yeah. What else caught your eye this morning? Annette and Jonna.
I was just curious if Noah has another meaning. I mean, as far as, in the language.
Yeah, we saw, I don't know if this is the fullness of it, but we saw in chapter 5 that Noah's father names him Noah because this is the one in whom the curse of the ground will be lifted and the ground will bring fruitfulness in a new way. So yeah, there's a little bit of that. Yes, for sure. Did you have something? Yeah, John.
In the first sentence, the Lord ties wickedness with humankind. But then 2 sentences later, he includes people with the animals, all of the animals. So what did the animals do?
What did they do?
How are they wicked?
Yeah, and I think we're supposed to ask that question. And we're not supposed to like the answer. And the answer is it doesn't matter. I think as the story unfolds, right? They're going to die too. Not all of them. There are going to be some that are saved. But we're supposed to wrestle with his story not simply as transgression and punishment, but as needing God's sense that we needed to start all over again. And so it's not just the humans that are being punished for their sin. It's the sin of the humans has shown God something's off. This creation is headed in the wrong direction. Let me flood it and start all over again. Yeah. Yeah, how does he choose? Yeah, that's fair. Yes, sir.
It's just that, did you say that, what did the animals do?
Yeah, what did the animals do?
Well, it's not about the saving thing, but they crawled and creeped and did stuff into the tent.
Yeah. Yes, there was grief. Yes.
And they crawled and creeped.
Oh, they crawled and creeped. Yeah, thank you. Trevor, Trent, did you have something? I'll keep calling Trent Trevor. I think it's going to be that way for the next 10 years. Get used to it, Trent. Trent, thank you. You even wore a name tag.
Yeah. So you were talking about the curse of the land being removed under Noah. So that's the curse under Cain. Spilling his brother's blood and the land is cursed.
Is it?
I don't know.
I thought it was the curse. Cain was cursed, but I thought that was the curse that was pronounced on Adam when they ate the fruit. And he said, you will toil in the ground and it will produce thorns and thistles.
But then the land becomes unproductive after the blood of
Cain? Oh,
Abel
maybe
was
that's it. Okay.
spilled in it.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I was just
Thank you.
wondering.
No, a good EFM mentor who knows the Old Testament
Well, I
better
was
than-
reading it this morning.
better than I
so-
do. Thank you.
Otherwise, I would
Thank you.
not
No,
have
I love
done
it.
that.
I love it. Thank you.
That's all I had to say.
Okay. Well, let's. I want to raise up for you a couple of words of note. Notice that Noah is described as a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Those are theologically laden terms that there might be a gap between what we assume they mean and maybe what the authors intended them to mean. When you hear blameless, how would you put that into another English word? How would you describe Noah who is blameless? Without sin? Innocent? Perfect? Yeah, and is he without sin or is he innocent? Right? Where's the right? Yeah. Yes, we've heard yes. The word apparently, and again, I don't know, Hebrew is not my biblical language, so I have to rely on other people to tell me this. But the word does not mean sinless, spotless. It means good and acceptable. An inaccurate translation might be pious, a piety. So he was a pious one, which is to say his life was appropriately devoted to God. So this same word is used for offerings that are spotless, which isn't a quality that the animal was always a good animal. It just means that this animal is an acceptable offering. It doesn't have it's not lame in its right leg. It's fully appropriate. And so when God names Noah as blameless, God is not saying that Noah is without sin. The reader would not have assumed that. The reader would say, oh, he's a really good guy that has good standing with God. The word righteous sort of meaning good standing, good relationship with God. And so it's worth noting that there's something about Noah that God sees goodness in. God is still able to look at Noah and see the goodness, the very goodness that he has created. So there's something there. It's not just that he didn't screw up and doesn't deserve the punishment. It's that God has lost the ability to see in humanity and in creation the goodness with which it was originally created, except for Noah. Noah still shines with that original goodness in that kind of way, for what it's worth. Yeah? Yeah. Liz.
So it says he has 3 sons, so he's leaving those sons behind. And
They're going to join him on the ark. We'll see that in a minute. Yeah. They're going to join him. And 2 of them end up to be really nice guys, and one of them not so nice for a really silly reason. 2 weeks. It's the sons. It's really confusing. If you think God deciding to end the lives of all the people and animals is confusing, wait till you get to chapter 9. All right, the other bit that I wanted to highlight for y'all is Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That's a remarkable statement about Noah. And we are ending one eon of human-divine relationship, and we're beginning a new one. Noah's kind of the last of the pre-patriarchs and matriarchs, right? So Noah is, after the flood, we get Abraham, kind of the next person on the story. And we get, oh, look at that, the history. It comes. Noah walked with God. Enoch also walked with God. Adam didn't even walk with God. Adam walked before God, kind of like over there a little bit, not really that close. But there's something about the way Noah is remembered as one who walks with God. And I think that's an important tidbit as we move forward and we think about why Noah and what's Noah really supposed to be doing. So let's read the next big paragraph. Who would read for us, please, 11 through 22? Thank you so much, Janice.
Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above. and put the door of the ark in its side, make it lower, second and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him.
Thank you. Would somebody else now read the next paragraph to the bottom of the page in a different voice? Who might read that bit? Somebody will. Oh, Kristen will. Excuse me.
Then the Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark, and you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on all the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground." And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him.
Thank you. Do you notice anything in that reading? What? Tell me. Who said yeah? Is that Janice? Yes. Clean and unclean. Yes, thank you. What else do you notice in those readings? The 2 voices that we heard. Yeah.
40 days and 40 nights.
40 days and 40 nights. Yes.
So okay, I realized that he's got 6 weeks worth of sacrifices.
Huh.
And then 1 left over.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, thank you. 6 weeks of sacrifice and 1 left over. 7 pairs. Yeah. What else? What else do you notice? You know, I'd never thought about this until a commentator pointed it out to me, but why do we call it an ark? Why not a ship? An ark is a box, like a chest. No, different ark. Good, different ark. This ark is a box, like a box of wood or a chest. A better translation, ark has become ark. We know Noah and the ark. Like if you asked people on the street to fill in the blank, Noah took animals 2 by 2 and they got on the blank, almost everybody would know ark, right? Or would get ark as the most popular answer. But chest or box would be a word, not ship, not boat. Like the Hebrew knows the word for ship. They know how to describe a boat. They're not interested in boat. It's a box. It's an ark. What other arks in the Bible? I heard it. Ark of the Covenant, right? What went in the Ark of the Covenant? 10 Commandments and the Urim and the Thummim and the right and some of the manna that was collected, right? Yeah. So so the 10 Commandments went in the ark. This is much later in the text, right? It's not in Genesis. This is much later. But in that ark, the ark that the priest carried, right? You put the 10 Commandments, some of the manna, and the magic dice that the high priest would use to figure out what God wanted us to do. That's not an exaggeration. That's really what it was. And so those were kept in an ark. Why is this an ark? What does that even connote to us? Other than it's not it's a really big ship. But what else does it connote to us?
I thought maybe because it's holding all of the gifts of life that the Lord has to give us.
Sure. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Do y'all listen to public radio? I listened to public radio this weekend, and I was listening to the NPR News Quiz Oh, wait, don't tell me. And you know that at the end of the show, they have this sort of litany of questions. And one of them is, at the local senior center, where people like to read, they decided to try something new. So they're now teaching the residents to do what? And the answer, which nobody would have ever guessed, is to build coffins. And the whole sort of, there was, it's a joke, right? What was it, really? Building coffins? That's an odd thing. But, a coffin, of course, is built for a purpose, to contain something sacred, us, right? Someone we love. And the ships are built to take a journey. You always expect to kind of get out. But an ark, or like a jewelry box, is something that you keep something safe in. And I think there's far more of that kind of connotation, and there's a holiness to that history, the holding on to that history, the preservation history. Where's the one of the universities? I think it's in the Midwest that is cataloging seeds of all the plants, right? Just to be in, and I think they might call it an ark. I'm not sure about that, but I think they call it an ark for the same reason, right? As climate change and species are lost, this ark is going to save them through this proverbial flood. Yeah. What else do you notice in these verses? That's what catches my eye. What else do you notice in these? Do you notice that there's a different voice? Like, I wonder if Noah woke up and thought that he was hearing things, because God first said to take how many of each animal? Two of each animal, male and a female, right there in verse 19. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark. But he went to sleep, and the next night the Lord showed up and said, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. And Noah thought, now wait a minute, I thought we had this all worked out. I thought I had done what you asked me to do, but apparently I was listening to the wrong voice. Why the discrepancy? Why? I mean, the people who wrote the story can tell that it didn't match up. Why the discrepancy? You ever think about things like that? You ever wonder? What do you think? What do you think Noah thought? Maybe that he was losing it. Yeah? What else? What else? Any thoughts? Thoughts about those voices? Yeah? I think we talked about last time how different members of our family would tell our family story a little differently. In order to get the fullness of the really big stories, we need to hear from several people. My grandmother needs to be able to chime in when my grandfather gets the story wrong and bring it sort of back. And then he'll say, that's what you remember. That's not what I remember. You'll get your turn, right? And so they have that kind of conversation. When the people of God gather together to tell the really big stories, we need to hear from more than one person telling that story. And I think we get different, slightly different remembrances, but they're so valuable that they're both included. It could be that we just leave out the disagreeing details, but some stories need that to tell us. And that tells us something about the nature of what's being told to us. The authors were smart enough to know that if there were conflicting details, people might not believe it. They were smart enough to know that, right? The way a police officer knows that if you don't tell your story straight, you're not quite believable. They knew that, but they left it here because that's not the kind of believability we're after. We're after a bigger truth than that. The Bible allows that. What else caught your eye or your ear in these bits? Yeah, Trent.
Using that metaphor of a coffin. And, we use the flood as a metaphor for baptism, of death and new life. And, it almost ties that more closely together than I had really held in my mind prior to looking at this right now.
Right. Would you hold on to that for us? And when we hear the actual language of flood in the next little bit, bring us back to baptism. Make sure that we get there if I forget. Thank you. Kristen?
Maybe also with the discrepancy of the numbers or whatever, maybe it was just Noah did what he was told. Maybe he just didn't question it.
That's right.
He just did it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that's a beautiful insight. Yeah, absolutely. Chapter 6, verse 22, Noah did this. He did everything that God commanded him. There's something about being righteous in God's eyes and sort of being faithful to the end. And we see it repeated again in verse 5 of chapter 7. And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. It's interesting that in one bit it's God doing it, and the other one it's sort of God's proper name, the Lord, Yahweh, doing it. But different ways of telling the same story. But the point is, no matter what God asked him to do, he was going to do it. Which is, and I put on the paper for you another question, which is, why all the details? Why 100 generations later does anybody care that it was 3 decks instead of 2 decks? Or that it was, 300 cubits long instead of 250 or 275 and 50? I mean, why tell us that you're covering it inside and out in pitch? And part of that is to convey to us that when God said do it, he did it. And it's not my insight. You've seen it before, I'm sure, elsewhere. But until this moment, not only was it a strange thing for Noah to build an ark, but it had never rained on the earth. Ever. Ever. There was no rain. Go back and read Genesis 1 through 5. The water kind of came up out of the ground and went back. So Noah's around. People are saying, what are you doing? He goes, it's going to rain. And they're like, rain? Rain? Right? I mean, imagine going to Ecuador and saying, I'm having a sale on winter parkas. A snowstorm is coming. Right? They would look at you like you were crazy. People looked at them like, what does that mean? The answer is God said do it. And he did it. And that's part of the lingering testimony that he gives us. Yeah. What else? Anything else catch your eye or your ear? All right, let's read the flood part and keep going. Okay, great. Yes.
So if he's going to cleanse the earth, and then here in paragraph, he says take a pair of unclean animals. So why is he including the unclean?
Great. Yeah, great question. Great question. So part of this work is to cleanse the earth, and yet God seems interested in preserving a mating pair of every species, including the ones that we're not allowed to touch or eat. Now granted, it's an anachronistic reference, right? Because we don't even find out what animals are clean until after Moses is in the desert a long time from now. In fact, to this point, everybody was still a vegetarian. Not only had it never rained, but everybody was a vegetarian. So its own kind of, what does that even mean? But why? I want to return to your question, which is why does God say to Noah, be sure to get one mating pair of every animal, even the unclean ones? Why?
You have to make everybody believe the story.
Yes. Yeah, to tell the story, absolutely. Yes. Why? Yes. And what else? Yes, to tell the story, but why bother? Why not just start over? I mean, if we're starting over, why preserve them?
Well, to me, this is a bit of an anachronism, because if he's upset about things not being great with the people and the animals and he wants to destroy everything, why does he preserve pairs?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, why? Trent?
Everything really is, in my mind, what's appropriate to the timing of this story. Clean and unclean comes down the road when we get the temple and sacrifices, and certain temples or certain animals are appropriate for certain purposes because they are clean. Yeah. So I think you're kind of maybe weaving some traditions of the story into the story before they were really pertinent.
Yes. I want us to use the question, which is why bother to preserve a pair of every species, a mating pair. I want us to return to the first question that we heard, which is why Noah? Why bother choosing Noah? And I invited, if God intends to blot out everything, to start over, why not just start over? Why let Noah and his family live? Why use the animals that were, and there's a tension, isn't there, between God has sort of decided that he's going to start all over. I mean, the language we see is terrible language. I'm going to blot them out. I'm not just going to kill them. I'm going to blot them out as if they were never here. Yet, God says, make sure you get one of every animal, because actually, maybe there's a limit. Maybe even in this chaotic recreation, God chooses limits, because even though it seemed like everything was all the way gone, maybe it wasn't completely gone. Maybe there was something worth holding on to an ark to save it. Kristen?
So maybe so we can learn from this. Here's what God did before. Here's what happened, and we have another opportunity.
Yes.
To remind people of the future.
Yes. Y'all have figured out I'm a bit of a nerd, and And as a bit of a nerd, one of the favorite things that I did as a child, my father and I on Monday nights would watch Star Trek: The Next Generation. We loved it. He had loved the original Star Trek when he was in college, and I got to love The Next Generation. And there's this one episode in which the crew of the Enterprise encounters a xenophobic species that does not want anybody to know that they're there, and so they plan to kill everybody on the ship. But Data, the android, says, I'll tell you what, instead of that, why don't you just wipe off the memories of everybody, and I promise I'll never tell anybody. Right? But of course, they're suspicious, and they keep finding clues, and Data every time has to say, you told me not to tell you, and the audience knows what's going on anyway. But yeah, without that person who knows the story, even though in this case, the showcase, Data was never to repeat it, without Noah, there would be no testament. And I wonder, as you invite us, what about the other animals too? They are a testament. The fact that we still have ostriches, that God didn't just wipe off ostriches and start over with something else that we might imagine, says something about the nature of that continuity and that learning. So let's look at the text. Who would read for us, please? Verses 6 through 16, those two paragraphs, 6 through 16. Alice, would you do that? Thank you. And who would then pick up with 17 and read 17 through 24? Trent, would you do that since you're sitting really close? Thank you.
Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came on the earth. And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on all that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. On the very same day, Noah with his sons Shem and Ham and Japheth and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark, they and every wild animal of every kind, and all domestic animals of every kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every bird of every kind, every bird, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in.
The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days.
Thank you. What do you notice? What are the details that hold you? Adam.
I was struck by the clean and unclean animals. You know, like well, the human beings, no, we're not going to do the unclean human beings, but the unclean animals, yeah, sure, we'll bring them on too. It just kind of stood out to me.
Yeah, and I think there's that. I think generations later, when God's people know the difference between kosher and unkosher, it's of note that God would save the unclean animals when God didn't have to. Right? What does that tell us?
I'd like to think that God was ecological,
Mm-hmm.
and that just because some animals are clean for us to eat, there might be a purpose to the ones that we don't eat as
Yes.
well.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Ecological. Absolutely. What else catches your eye or your ear?
This is kind of back a couple paragraphs, but I do want to throw it in. In verse 20, it says that the birds and the animals according to their kinds, and every creeping thing, two of every kind shall come into you. It doesn't say that Noah went and grabbed all these, but that all these animals came to him. And so we can ask why Noah, but we could ask, why this pair of birds?
Yeah.
And it would make sense, as much as everything else in here makes sense, it would make sense that God chose those birds.
Yes.
God told those birds to be in this place at this time, and that they were all as inexplicably chosen as Noah was.
Yes, yes. Which is to just remind us who's really as the story's told to us, who's in control, right? God's in control. God's got everything worked out. Yeah. Thank you.
What interests me was in where it talks about the water swelled above the mountains, and it talks about 15 cubits covered on 15 cubits deep. To me, that's real interesting. If anybody's ever seen mountains, you know how high they are. So the fact that the water was able to cover up those high mountains that much is really eye-opening.
Yes, enough to cover the highest mountain and then some, right? Yeah, absolutely. Elliot.
I know pretty quickly the obsession with detail and measurements and things that it's curious to me. It also, and I remembered learning about a cubit, and it was, I think, the distance from the forefinger to the elbow or something like that, roughly 20 inches. But does it matter if we're 15 cubits above the peaks and not tear into the hull of the ship? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I found that interesting. But I also find it curious that this is a place in the Scripture that certain folks like to use as a real thing, and they don't let go of that. So I don't know where they find them, and now I'm seeing with this review that, okay, they are stashed in here in the story of Noah.
Yeah.
A lot more than I previously thought.
Thank you. Oh, yes, back over here, and then I'll ask y'all a question.
This may be a little frivolous, but what happens to all the animals of the sea and the creatures? It's never mentions those animals, and those are the only ones that pretty much people eat. So
I guess they make it. I guess they make it at this point. Kristen, do you have a follow-up?
I mean, I guess kind of along those lines, but what struck me was the sadness when it says, because it says everything on dry land, kind of making your point, in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. And that really, oftentimes you go, oh, he wiped everything out, and you don't really think about it. But when we read this, it really, if you really think about it, everything is gone. It is dramatic.
Yeah, yesterday, let me say, this morning when I read the news, the total of those who were killed in the earthquake and tsunami in Indonesia yesterday was 800 and something. By the end of the day, it'll be in at least 1,000, one would imagine. And that kind of number is just hard to get one's mind around. But details like this, in whom was the breath of life, there's a real, we might use language like snuffed out. There's something really physical and visceral about that description, and the author doesn't want us to miss it. The author doesn't want us to think that this was, oh yeah, God decided to start over. He wants us to encounter the magnitude of that. Where did the flood waters come from? Yeah, up and down, right? And I love the language of the Hebrew text. that the windows of heaven were opened. Verse 11. The fountains of the great deep, the great sea, verse 4, and the windows of heaven were opened. Do you remember, and I've given you the citation, first Genesis chapter 1, verse 7. This is from the creation story. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and he called the expanse heaven. Right? This kind of primitive understanding that above heaven there are the waters of chaos, and below heaven there are the waters of chaos. And what God is doing is God is opening the windows of heaven so that the waters, that God did the business of separating them, and now God's letting it all come back together. God is really uncreating. This isn't really a story of punishment. It's a response to the humanity's wickedness. But they weren't just wicked, they were determined to be wicked. And so what God is doing is God is saying, let's undo this. Let's undo creation. Let's open the heavens. Let's raise up the fountains. Let's put so much water on the earth that it covers the mountains by 15 cubits, which is to say we're going to start all over, except for Noah and the ark. Yeah, Liz.
So it says 40 days and 40 nights, but the last sentence of this says, and the water swelled on the earth for 150 days.
Uh-huh.
So are they still on that ark?
Oh, yes.
For 150 days. So it wasn't just 40 days and 40 nights.
Even longer. Yeah. And we read recently some flooding. Sort of, I can't remember the most recent places there. In South Carolina, right, with the hurricane Florence coming in. That actually, after the hurricane was gone, sometimes it got worse because the water had fallen on highland, and now the real flooding happens. Yeah. So I think it's one of those senses. Yeah. What do you think? Right. We find ourselves wrestling with that, and the author is using these techniques. There's a reason that we show cartoons and sing songs and tell our kids this story, because it's a catchy story. It's catchy. 2 by 2 on the ark, building it out of wood, floating, 40 days, 40 nights. It's a catchy story. It allows us to tell it easily. What we're telling might be something we haven't thought of, but it's catchy. And these are narrative devices to draw us into the story, because we need to wrestle with the story. We need to wrestle with what it tells us. Flood narratives are in lots of traditions. There are some, I'm sure, scholars here that know more about Near Eastern theology than I will ever know. But the Gilgamesh epic, y'all know the Gilgamesh epic, maybe the oldest bit of advanced literature. And apparently, Tablet 9 of the Gilgamesh epic tells the story of a flood, the Great Flood. This is a story in the Assyrian tradition, in the Babylonian tradition, in the Persian tradition, in the Sumerian tradition. This is a part of who we are. All people, not just the people of Israel, but all people throughout history wrestle with this. They wrestle with the thought that the gods, or in our case, God, has this power and used it once, and we still tell the story of it being used once. And unfortunately, we're going to stop today with it not finished, because next week, when the waters start to dry up and the people leave the ark, God shows up and makes a promise. But the promise he makes, y'all know the promise, I will never flood the whole earth again. That's critical. And we find ourselves living in that tension. The whole story is about bringing us to that tension, which is, why not again? Why not again? And so we're stuck there. So we tell this story to remind ourselves who God is and who we are. And we live in that tension. Well, why Noah? Why not just blot everybody out? Why a living pair? Why a mating pair of every animal? Why not just start over? Because that's not how we tell the story of who God is. That's not how God is showing up to us. God is interested in a relationship that persists beyond even our most terrible transgressions. And we see that woven in these prehistory bits. And those questions, those unanswerable questions, we're drawn into right there. That's what we got today. Come back. Oh, Judy really wants to say one more thing. Yes?
What is meant by Earth?
Earth?
The Earth. We think of the Earth as a planet, but they didn't have that idea back then. So what did they mean?
Yeah, yes, where we live, land and sea. Yeah, land and sea. Thank y'all for being here today. Next week, the covenant, the rainbow, the happy ending to the story or not. Hope to see you then. Thank you.